everybody. It's so wonderful to be back here. I love this conference. Wow, thank you. I just want to thank John Rayo, Angela, and Alejandro, and all of the other people who have made this such a wonderful experience for all of us. It's always so great here, and I'm just particularly happy this year to be here. It's been wonderful. I want to thank the boys in the back for playing Rage for me. I did ask for that. I thought, why not? So I have a lot to discuss, not enough time to discuss it. I want to get right into it. This is a brand new lecture that I have developed for this event, and I'm excited about it, actually, and I'm excited to give it to you here. It's about media coverage of UFOs, and it covers really the entire gamut of how media has covered this subject over really the last human lifetime. So let's get started. We all kind of know that the media doesn't really tell the truth all the time. That's Anderson Cooper. And Anderson Cooper's kind of cool. Everyone loves him. Of course, he is a 2-year CIA intern. Just want to point that out. That's kind of typical, par for the course of mainstream media. They work with the intelligence community, have always done so. I'm going to get into that in more detail. I'm very glad in our society today that we've got this conversation going about fake news. It's very important. I think, however, that the way that the corporate establishment, mainstream media has formulated the idea of fake news is going to backfire. It is backfiring on them because I think that increasingly people in the country are realizing these guys are the true purveyors of fake news. The mainstream media is not your friend. Don't forget that fact. It lies, it spins, and it censors. Those three things alone, probably account for 90+% of the mind control that exists over most of the population. By censoring, they simply omit what they don't want in the reality. They create reality by omission. But they do lie as well, and always spinning news for the way they want it to go. That's a quote by Roger Ailes, the recent head of Fox News. The truth is whatever people will believe. He's not the only one to say that. The other thing about mainstream media, it's owned by a very few corporations. It's an oligarchy. And it has, yes, this is an important point, it has merged with our popular entertainment culture in a very bizarre way. You go back 50 years, you think of people like Walter Cronkite of CBS News. At least the image, if nothing else, of the mainstream media was separate from that of pop culture. Not any longer. The news people themselves have become celebrities. They cover celebrities. There's this mixing and merging, and where does the one begin and the other end? We don't really know. It's all one 24/7 immersion into this corporate culture that hits us every single day. The other thing about the mainstream media is that it does cooperate with the intelligence community. I've sort of been alluding to this right out of the gate. I'm going to get more and more into it, but that's a fact. And the other thing is that it makes us sick. Mainstream media really does literally make many of us sick. I know people who have had anxiety disorders and have seen therapists about this. And a typical thing a therapist will do is they will do an inventory with you. What are you ingesting into your life? Not just food, but your friends, your media. What do you read? What do you do in your life? And one of the first things a good therapist will do is if you're watching a lot of mainstream news is they will tell you, don't watch mainstream. Don't watch the news, right? So why is that? Is it that the news inherently is bad for us? I don't believe that. I don't believe that the news is bad for you. I don't think it's bad for you, for your mental health, to know what's happening in the world. However, the way that news in our society is packaged and fed to you, that is unhealthy. And there's a reason for that. The other thing that, and by the way, along those lines, here's a couple of mainstream news articles on why the mainstream news makes you sick. This is as mainstream as it gets, BuzzFeed and The Guardian. These are just two of many, many pieces about how it is actually true and has been shown in scientific studies how ingesting the news, as it were, is not good for our mental health, and it actually can destabilize personalities. It also destabilizes societies. The mainstream news does help to destabilize societies. Top left, you're looking at Venezuela, which was a subject of an ongoing, what we might call color revolution operation led by U.S. intelligence. One of the ways that they do this is you invade the mainstream news of that country. You demonize the politicians and political structure that you want to demonize. You get people worked up, and they start burning things. On the bottom left, you have Brazil. A year ago, around this time, Brazil was subject to what we call a soft coup or a Wall Street coup, backed by, I am convinced, NSA and U.S. intelligence, where for 2 years they demonized the president of that country, a very nice lady, socialist Dilma Rousseff, who they turned into Satan 2.0 and got the crowds against her. And now Brazil, after an illegal impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, is now back under the control of Goldman Sachs and U.S. National Security crowd. They got Brazil again. Bottom right, you see Macedonia. This is going on right now. So it's another color revolution. All you need to do a color revolution and destabilize a country is about $1 billion, and then you just go in and you invade with your fake websites, your fake Twitter feeds, your YouTube channels, and all of that. And you create the infrastructure, and you have your cadres and your worker bees, and they bring the public in, and you create a movement. They do it all the time. That's Macedonia. In the top right, of course, is USS Berkeley. A couple of weeks ago, after 2 years of demonization of the other guy in our country, he's Satan 2.0, and half the country believes that he is. He's out to throw you into prison or do whatever. Not saying he's the salvation. I'm on the fence about a lot of things. I criticize a lot of the things that he does. However, what is undeniable is a 2-year concerted effort to turn one man into the next Hitler. And as a result, you have people willing to burn things and break windows and so forth. So that's what mainstream news media does. It destabilizes you, it destabilizes your society. Now, that's not going to be my lecture, that's just a prologue. This is a media that also has had a relationship to the UFO phenomenon for a long time. And as any good historian would say, there's been continuity and change. That's really the ultimate historical cop-out, but it is true in this case. So what I'm going to try to explain to you is that there has been a very strong thread of continuity from the 1940s to this very day, in which the establishment media, let's call it that, has been unremittently hostile to anything having to do with UFOs. So the big media has never, not once, really treated the UFO subject in a way that we would call dignified or positive, in a way that would promote belief in the subject. They have never done that. In fact, over the years, I detect that they have gotten actually doubled down and become more hostile and more snarky and more smarmy than even they were in the 1950s. The other thing that you see, though, is there has been smaller media, alternative media. So in the 1950s and 60s, it was local newspapers. Now it's alternative media. And there's always been a proportion of them that have been more inquisitive about the phenomenon. Remember when Hillary adopted that alien baby? Wasn't that adorable? That was wonderful. So what we see is that over the years, the media has become consolidated. I remember back in the 1980s, I read a really great book by a media analyst named Ben Bagdikian called The Media Monopoly, 1980-something study. And back then he said there were 50 corporations that dominated like 90% of all of the news you read. Now that number is 6. So it's very, very tightly consolidated. So we've seen that happen. We've also seen that the dominance of the media has moved. Back in the 1940s and 50s, it was basically newspapers. By the 1960s and 70s, it was newspapers plus television. And now we're in an era in which it's really television and the web. So it has sort of migrated to these different media. But as I say, the propaganda remains consistent, and we see a continued strong relationship of the dominant media with CIA and the intelligence agencies. And we see that the role of independent reporting moves from local newspapers to alternative media. So let's do a little historical tour. Back in the 1940s, we had the Foo Fighter phenomenon, and these were UFOs. They weren't really identified as aliens from outer space or anything like that, but there was a phenomenon in Europe, also in the Pacific, in which objects in the sky were seen by pilots. They did not know how to explain these things. Balls of light, sometimes following the aircraft, shooting straight up. Very unusual. They were called Foo Fighters. The media coverage of this was limited, but it didn't engage in ridicule. So that's a New York Times article up there, in which it just describes this phenomenon. It publicly attributed it to probable German technology. That was the best guess that they had. This was not a big deal, though. This was not a big public relations problem to deal with. There was no public ridicule involved in it. We do know, just to point out, that the Foo Fighter phenomenon was studied by a variety of intelligence agencies. We do not have the conclusions, the official conclusions that those agencies had. Nonetheless, the reporting on it was fairly low-key. Ditto with a year or two later with the ghost rockets, and this was after World War II had ended in 1946. We see over Sweden, Scandinavia, and then moving through Europe, and particularly down to Greece, a phenomenon. No one knew what these things were. They were called ghost rockets. There's continued a lot of research on this has continued to this day. People have different opinions. What we can say about the media coverage of it is that this is an AP article from the summer of 1946. And again, you see the same tendency of basically straight-up reporting, not a whole lot of ridicule, but very sparse, not a lot. But this particular article was quite good. So it talked about the objects streaking daily over Sweden, and describing them as mysterious spool-shaped objects. I think it's quite interesting, or spool-shaped missiles, rocket-propelled objects. And then they were speculating as to where they originated. In this case, they thought in really the northern coast of what was then East Germany. And then indicated that fragments of these rockets, or these objects, really, were examined. So material objects came down and were examined, but we didn't really know what they were. So what I would say is that the journalistic coverage of the ghost rockets was limited, but it wasn't, again, we didn't have the ridicule factor coming in. And by the way, that media coverage ended almost very abruptly, actually, after a couple of U.S. generals visited Sweden privately and had some discussions with high-level officials, and then boom, media coverage pretty much went away. The ridicule started in 1947. And of course, this is a headline of the New York Times right after the Roswell event, when the New York Times just said, nope, they said it was a flying disc, but the intelligence experts of the 509th Bomber Unit apparently don't know what a tattered weather balloon is. That's all that they saw, people. The New York Times used a phrase in there, a number of really snarky phrases. One was celestial crockery. That's how the Times is. They're very erudite, right? And they use these little verbal taekwondo to make you think, oh yeah, I'm going to be in on the joke too. Those dummies. And so they write here, what a colleague thought was a flying disc was nothing more than a battered Army weather balloon. Seriously. And of course, we know that that article by the New York Times was itself a lie. We know this. And even that was admitted years later by the Air Force itself, which said, well, it wasn't a weather balloon, it was a different kind of balloon. Of course, they were also lying. But we know that the New York Times was really doing the work for the military complex. Very important. As I put this in my very first book, the Army baked it, the Army baked it, the press served it, and the public ate it. That was and I think that's really what they did. But we see in 1947, because of the wave of flying saucers that spread throughout the United States, because this became a thing, it became a big public issue, because lots of people were seeing these unusual objects in 1947 here in the United States. It had to be taken out. And this is not just the New York Times, but we see media across the U.S. smearing and ridiculing the UFO phenomenon. At the same time in 1947, let's just look at the politics for a moment. We see the establishment of what was the National Security Act in the summer of 1947. We sometimes forget about this. So that's what created the CIA. That is what gave the CIA vast unacknowledged powers and unsupervised powers at the time. Not many people knew about the CIA for a while. And meanwhile, you've got UFOs just being seen all over the nation and all over the world. So the media was not fully consolidated during those years the way it is now. I mean, if you're a big, powerful intelligence agency that establishes relationships with media, it's a lot easier to do it if you only have a few top executives to deal with as opposed to 50 or 100 or 200 executives to deal with. And so there was much more of a disparate level of coverage. And so there was good local reporting of the UFO phenomenon throughout the early Cold War period. There were still many independent newspapers. And the coordination was not fully worked out with the intelligence community. These are just a couple of articles. You see, 5 or 6 out of hundreds or even more of genuine, decent journalistic pieces on the UFO phenomenon that we saw during the 1940s and 50s. David Marler's here, one of our really great treasures in this field. David has a collection of newspaper clippings of the UFO phenomenon. I encourage you to go to his table and look at them. It's fascinating. He's got an amazing collection of this. So what we see is a very good job of American journalism and international journalism as well during this period of time. It really peaked, I think we can say, around 1952. That was a very big year of UFO sightings in the United States for civilians and for the military. At the same time, the UFO phenomenon in the United States gained very high levels of concern within the CIA and elsewhere in the world of intelligence. This is my very favorite, I think, possibly really the most important statement of the declassified literature that we have. Keep in mind that during the 1940s and 50s and 60s, a lot of conversations were going on in the classified world about UFOs, the people having no expectation that their documents would ever become public. And then in the late 1970s, we had a Freedom of Information Act that shocked them all, I'm sure, and under the presidency, particularly of Jimmy Carter, thousands of pages were released. This is one of the documents that came out. It was a letter, a memo to the director of the CIA by his director of scientific intelligence, H. Marshall Chadwell. I will just read this to you. I've read it before. I think it bears reading every time. At this time, he says, reports of incidents convince us that there is something going on that must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. Let that sink in. That's a very direct statement written in very explicit language. And he's being very careful, isn't he, when he's writing to Walter Beadle Smith, director of the CIA. He's not really saying, boss, I think we're being invaded, but he's maybe saying that. He's saying that there's things happening, and we have no idea what they are, and they don't appear to be Soviet, they don't appear to be ours, and they're not natural phenomena. So do the math. This was all being discussed in high levels. Edward Ruppelt, the former head of Project Blue Book in 1951 and 52, described in his book, published a couple of years later, the same type of scenario going on. And he just said, UFOs were seen more frequently around areas vital to the defense of the United States. The Los Alamos, Albuquerque area, Oak Ridge, and White Sands Proving Grounds rated high. Port areas, strategic air command bases, and industrial areas ranked next. So think about this. So you have a kind of ranking that was going on and a clear indication that these objects, whoever they belong to, were interested in our important areas for our infrastructure. That's very significant from a defense point of view, and it's certainly something that if you've got coordination with media, you may not want to get out. By the end of 1952, when that CIA memo that I just read was written, this was being organized, what's known as the Robertson Panel. That is H.P. Robertson, intelligence community extraordinaire, scientist, very powerful man, friend of Albert Einstein, friend of Robert Oppenheimer. The CIA had H.P. Robertson organize, or had him lead, rather, the last significant event of the Truman White House. Harry Truman left the White House on January 20th, 1953. This convened, ended on January 18th, 1953, from January 14th to the 18th. It was organized by the CIA. It formalized the UFO debunking program. As we now know, the conclusions of the Robertson panel were formulated before they even met. It was a given for them that in their debunking campaign, mainstream media compliance would be a no-brainer. So some of their recommendations that the Air Force began a, quote, debunking effort to reduce, quote, public gullibility and to demystify UFO reports. This debunking aim, they said, would result in reduction in public interest in flying saucers, which today, they said, evokes a strong psychological reaction. Stop right there. Is it fair to say, does one think in our culture today that UFOs evoke a strong psychological reaction? Well, maybe in this room, perhaps. Maybe if this lecture goes to YouTube, people watching it, perhaps. But in the mainstream public, I don't think so. I don't think it evokes a strong psychological reaction. But they're saying, the CIA in 1953 is saying that flying saucers evoke a strong psychological reaction. I am going to submit to you that one reason is because news coverage of this phenomenon back then was much more fair and much more open and out in the open than it is now. And the public was much more willing to be engaged with it. Anyway, he goes on. They say this education, this like re-education essentially, could be accomplished by mass media such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles. So they're getting right into it, media manipulation. They say that we need to use public relations campaigns. We should use psychiatrists, astronomers, and celebrities. They recommended using Walt Disney Corporation to create movies and media for that purpose. And, oh yes, that the government should be monitoring these civilian groups that study UFOs because of their potentially great influence on mass thinking and the possible use of such groups for subversive purposes. So again, back to the Russians. It's always the Russians. They're going to use civilian UFO groups somehow to undermine confidence in the government, just like today. So the thing about the Robertson panel, it's supposedly was a scientific study of UFOs. It was anything but. It was a totally political way of nailing down this phenomenon and gaining control over it through mainstream media. And it worked. Not immediately. So, for example, through 1953 and into early 1954, there was still reporting, uncomfortable reporting, about the UFO phenomenon. Here's an article from February of 1954, and I think it's significant, frankly, talking about how commercial airline pilots were seeing lots of these UFOs. And this article says 5 to 10 saucers reported nightly by airline pilots. That's incredible. Now, that doesn't mean that they were all alien craft. Obviously, an unusual sighting can be anything. But the fact is that this was considered important, and it was getting concerned, and was getting headlines. So, what happens? 1 month later, oh, what did I just? Did I just delete a, I deleted a slide accidentally. That's okay, I'll just talk about it. I don't know how that happened. I apologize. 1 month later, in March of 1954, we see the order JANAP 146 coming through. And what that was is a military order. It was a classification, essentially, that revised reporting procedures by not simply military pilots, but also including commercial pilots in on this. And one of the things that became the law for these pilots after the passage of JANAP 146 was, if you saw what you thought was a UFO, there were very specific protocols for you to report this to military channels. It then became classified, and you were then no longer permitted to discuss that report with the press. Get it? Yes, indeed. So that was one of the significant things that the national security state did to clamp down on reporting of UFOs in the 1950s, and it worked. Reportings by pilots of UFOs went down considerably, which it is to this day. Pilots, of course, I'm sure many of them are in this audience, are quietly and definitely, many of them, interested in UFOs, but they have learned not to talk about it too openly to their peers because it could damage their job. Sorry that I accidentally deleted that slide. I don't know how that happened. By the later part of 1954, we see that the program is really now solidifying. This is a statement by Dwight Eisenhower, reported dutifully by the New York Times, as they always do. This is the Times speaking. They're paraphrasing Eisenhower, saying, "Flying saucers were not invading Earth from outer space. All the news on the subject from the Air Force was reassuring. Thank you, Air Force." In fact, this is the New York Times. Again, here comes the snarkiness. "If the Air Force were not tactful, it might scoff at the whole business publicly. Some of its spokesmen just scoffed in private." Ha, 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 ha. So, again, this is the New York Times, nose in the air, trying to indicate to you how you're supposed to act and think about all of this. This was the pattern through the 1950s and early 1960s. In fact, it's really continued. I'm jumping ahead to the CBS UFO special of 1966. This is not newspapers, this is television, and that is Walter Cronkite. There was a very interesting televised special, kind of like a documentary, on UFOs. It was called UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy. Well, you can kind of guess by the title itself, the way that they positioned it, what the answer was going to be. This is a typical tactic that you find with TV documentaries, as I find. The same thing happened with the Peter Jennings special back in, I think, 2004. They did a big one on UFOs then. I always caution people, anytime the mainstream is going to do a big coverage of the UFOs, I say, don't get excited. Don't get excited. Because it's like they take a balloon and they fill it up for the first half, and then they deflate it for the second half. That's really that's what happened here with the CBS special. So Cronkite, in his conclusion, you can find this on YouTube, incidentally. It's very interesting to watch. He says, no evidence that anything out there has come here. One thing is clear. You could not keep a spaceship a secret. And that's what he said. Direct quote. And then he got on to say that not only that, but you, the public, you really need to chill, because this is really best handled by scientists who know what they're talking about, and the military. And then we cuts to this fellow here. You may remember Carl Sagan, a very young, dapper Carl Sagan. And yes, he does sound as arrogant as he looks in that picture, I have to say. He really, he's got that sonorous, nice tone that he always had. And he's tossing out the phraseology, and he talks about, in this interview here, the flying saucer myths, and he uses the word pseudoscientific. Sounds very, very educated, and it's a tactic. That's all it is, it's a tactic. He says that flying saucers and UFOs belong to psychology and theology, not so much to the physical sciences, and that's really where they kind of leave that whole special. What we know about that CBS special is that major consulting was done by the CIA. And not only was it done by the CIA, but it was explicitly tied to the Robertson panel recommendations from 13 years earlier. So this was still in effect to whatever extent. And we don't really know all of the examples that the Robertson panel's recommendation were explicitly used in the mainstream media to debunk UFOs, but it was used at least in this one instance, probably others. And we know this is a letter from a Robertson panel member, Thornton Page, which confirmed the CIA's role in that documentary. Now, Robertson panel, in my view, is part of a larger program that was going on during the entire Cold War era, and that is part of what is called Operation Mockingbird. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, some of you may not be. So Mockingbird was first uncovered during the 1975 Senate hearings investigating the U.S. intelligence community, the Church Committee hearings, then written about by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame in 1977. Basically, Mockingbird was a CIA program to manage mainstream media. Not less than 400 U.S. journalists were on the CIA payroll covertly to do a variety of things. Spin news, lie, make stuff up. Oh yes, they would make up fake stories, send them on the wire services, AP and UPI in particular, start them out in foreign countries, and they would make the rounds and then come back to the U.S. in that manner. So Mockingbird was a full-court press attempt to manage the news that was coming to you. And of course, the subversive thing about it, when we think about it, is that we rely on the media for our news. And particularly as citizens, and what we want to think of as a free republic, we need news, accurate news, coming to us so that we can make intelligent decisions. But if that news is being managed by the very elites that we're trying to watch, that's a problem. That's what Mockingbird was. All right, so here's the idea of planting news stories. This is reported. I mean, the New York Times will report true news once in a while, usually when it becomes irrelevant. as was the case here. This is a 2001 story. And of course, it's very, very limited in its spin. So they're talking about this one example in which the CIA tried to plant news in Cuba in 1961. Well, yes, they did, but the reality is that they were planting news everywhere. It wasn't just Cuba, as the Times reported. So, but pointing out that the CIA had relationships with AP and UPI wire services and so forth, as I just said. Sigmund Mickelson, very powerful director of CBS TV News during the 1960s. This is an obituary of him from 2000. I think really epitomized the attitude that news media executives had in those days when the CIA approaches you to have a relationship. He said, look, I didn't raise an eyebrow about cooperating with them at that time. They were patriots, as they saw it, and it's not hard to understand, you know, if the whole thing is packaged to you as, well, there's a war going on and the Russians are propagandizing against us. We have to fight back in the same way, and we have to use our own resources to propagandize against them. They're like, yes, and that is exactly what they did. So whatever their motivations were, they did, in fact, subvert the very institutions that are to defend our freedoms, which is to have free information. My old friend and many of our friends and colleagues, the late Terry Hansen, created an earlier version of this chart that I'm showing you here. Terry was the author of the very great classic in our field, The Missing Times, News Complicity in the UFO Cover-Up. He died all too soon, in my opinion. But Terry put this together. I think this is good. It's a bit incomplete, to be honest with you, but it's a good way to look at news media management during the Cold War. So we have the Robertson panel at the top, coming straight down through the CIA. Wisner's Wurlitzer was the phrase used. Frank Wisner was a high-level CIA officer in the 1950s and early 60s, and he had the relationships with the newspapers and the news media sources. Through them, New York Times, Time Inc., CBS, NBC, ABC, all the wire services, and you'll see on one side there, the National Enquirer. We will get to that in just a moment. There's Terry, a couple of pictures. I miss Terry. He was I'm sure many of you remember him. I always felt a very strong simpatico nature with Terry. Our research always seemed to dovetail in many ways, and we had a very good relationship. And in part, I wanted to do this lecture, not simply for Terry, but really because his work was so important in opening up our understanding of news media complicity in the UFO cover-up. And since he's gone, and since I felt so compatible with his research, this is one reason I wanted to do this lecture here for you, and really take what he did and sort of bring it a little more up to date. Along these lines, I just want to point out these two books. These are not new books. They're old. There's a lot of other studies that cover the same topic, but these are both very academic works. And these deal with the CIA's relationship not to news media, but to two other major institutions. It's relevant for today. The book on your right, Cloak and Gown, by Robin Winks, who is no longer alive, was a book that I read way back in the 1980s, and it was about scholars in the secret war, basically the CIA's relationship to academia, particularly focusing on Yale University. I wonder if I could ask for a glass of water. Oh, here we are. Good, thank you. Winks did a very excellent analysis for that time on how the CIA really got its hooks into the major American academic institutions. And then the book on your left, The Cultural Cold War, from around 2000 or so by Francis Stoner Saunders. This is a very important book. It's not about the media, it's not about academia, it's about CIA and the world of arts and letters, that is cultural institutions, and how the CIA would get involved in left-wing and right-wing groups, and essentially managing the spectrum of what would be acceptable public discourse very intelligently. Things to keep in mind. So the Mockingbird program, then, I think was a very comprehensive program, and the UFO phenomenon was part of the Mockingbird operation. And think about it, I don't know of any Mockingbird historians who talk about UFOs as part of it, but it is a fact, UFOs were part of it. Why do I say this? You have the media in those days, as well as today, I'll get to, dominated by national security needs. You have a media that had to cover UFOs, dismissed and debunked UFOs, specifically because UFOs were part of national security concerns. So clearly the UFO phenomenon was part of the Operation Mockingbird's programmed to control news media. Why was the National Enquirer significant? This is something that Terry wrote a lot about. There's our Enquirer. Well, the National Enquirer was founded by this guy, Gene Pope, or Generoso Pope, Jr. Back in 1952, he bought what was then the New York Enquirer, which was more of a standard newspaper in that time. It was not a tabloid, sensationalist type of a thing. For $75,000, which was a fair amount of money at that particular time. 2 years later, he changed it to the National Enquirer, made it very sensationalist and so on, what it is today. There were always rumors that some of the money used to buy the National Enquirer came from mafia money, particularly the mobster Frank Costello, who was gunned down in the streets of New York in 1954. But it's also true that Gene Pope had worked with the CIA back in 1951. Not just any CIA unit, but the CIA's psychological warfare unit. Just so happens. And allegedly left the agency in 1952, the year he bought the Enquirer. It is true, not only did he spend $75,000, but he spent a lot more money, an estimated $250,000 over the next few years to keep it afloat because it was in bad financial shape and needed a lot of money to keep going. Where did that money come from? There is speculation, we do not know, that the CIA helped him. And the reason is that the CIA was involved at that time in working with mainstream newspapers for its own particular purposes. In the early 1960s, in the JFK years, John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a great economist, also became U.S. ambassador to India. And he said he found a newspaper in India strikingly similar to the National Enquirer in its look. And he's like, who did this? And he said that he later learned that it was financed by the CIA. This is Gene Pope in later years. This is an interesting story. So in the early 1970s, Pope was having a hard time getting the Enquirer into a major grocery store chain known as Winn-Dixie. Gene Pope had very good friends in high places. One of them was the U.S. Secretary of Defense. You might ask why. Why would Gene Pope be good friends with Melvin Laird? But he was. And there's a story that Laird arranged a tour of the Nixon White House for Winn-Dixie store executives and talked up Gene Pope so well and so effectively that the Winn-Dixie execs said, wow, the Enquirer's got some really good connections with the White House. Maybe we will carry them, and they did. So in all their supermarkets, you'd start seeing the Enquirer at the checkout line. There was a reporter, I think with Forbes, who in later years asked Pope, essentially, how is it that you've got these great relationships with these powerful people? And Pope said, it's just politics. One hand washes the other. This is what the Enquirer looked like in the 1960s. Basically, Elvis and breasts falling out of their tops. That was the National Enquirer. Very tabloidy, okay? This is the magazine that began covering UFOs in a serious way in the 1970s. And it was done in a serious way. Bob Pratt, the author of that article, and others in the Enquirer, was actually a serious journalist who did good work. And yet, it's within the context of this sensationalist tabloid that no one took seriously. This particular article, by the way, the UFOs spotted at nuclear bases and missile sites, had been reported in local Montana newspapers. This is something Terry Hansen did write about in his excellent book. So it had been written about close to immediately in 1975 and 76, but never made the wire services. The wire services were national, and they choked off the story. But the thing about those sightings, and they were very awesome sightings indeed, it is likely that they were bound to get some kind of coverage at some point. They weren't going to be buried forever. And so the first national coverage that those sightings got was in that newspaper, the National Enquirer, owned by Gene Pope, sensationalist newspaper. Now, why? At the same time, the Enquirer was still doing art stories on Elvis and the Bermuda Triangle, and there's a picture of Charlie's Angels, and all the nonsense that they continued to do, but they were doing stories on UFOs, some of which were done very well. So it's an interesting thing to ask ourselves. Well, what I would say, and I think what you might be inclined to agree with, is that the purpose of the Enquirer, probably, was to sensationalize good UFO information, to make it unpalatable, to make it laughable. You know, it's like getting an inoculation for a virus or for a disease. You know, you get a little bit of it, and then you're inoculated. So you get a little bit of the true information, but it's packaged in such a way that it's ridiculous. And you think, oh, yeah, the Enquirer, well, we know all about that. The Enquirer, many of you are aware, got very much involved with MUFON for some time. In fact, Bob Pratt became editor of the MUFON UFO Journal for a few years. I think it's a reasonable conclusion that the Enquirer worked with the CIA in a significant capacity and was there to help discredit UFOs. The Weekly World News was also created by Gene Pope in 1979. That was his baby. We remember some of these beautiful headlines. Alien backs Clinton, Bat child escapes, world's smallest face. I mean, the Weekly World News is fun. I used to enjoy looking at their headlines. Of course, they were completely over the top, right? But again, this whole idea that the UFO phenomenon was a very kind of recurring theme with the Weekly World News in just this most absurd, laughable manner. So let's move into our own era now. One of the things, before we get to the internet, we get to these, Freedom of Information Act era of the late 70s going into the 1980s. That at the time that those documents were released was a significant development. No one really knew where these new released documents would lead us. You know, if enough researchers shook the tree and the right document fell out, would that prove that the UFO phenomenon was extraterrestrial? This is what the holy grail that people were looking for. And what we can say about that is during all of that era, when these documents were being released, the coverage by New York Times, Washington Post, and the other mainstream outlets was virtually zero. They just ignored these Freedom of Information Act documents, which were really quite awesome indeed in many cases. It stayed that way until we get to the era of the internet. Remember the 90s? A nice family there. What the internet did, even by the late 1980s, before we had the web, we had the bulletin boards. And for those of you who remember this, the UFO field exploded in the late 1980s, and it is explicitly because of the new internet, these bulletin boards. As infant-like as they were in context of our world today, they were enough to explode what was then the suffocating paradigm created by mainstream news, which they dominated all the avenues of information. No longer. By the mid-1990s, it was very obvious that we were developing the beginnings of an alternative media, a true alternative media. Had never existed before, because we were able to get news independently of the mainstream narratives. It was, we forget this. We've been in this now for the last 20 plus years, but it was a revolution, a true revolution in our society. How did the mainstream establishment react to this new development in terms of UFOs and in terms of other fringe topics? They followed the rule that, who wrote it? Was it Schopenhauer? Was it Voltaire? When you get new information, you have 3 stages. First, first attack, then ridicule, then you say, oh yeah, we knew it all along. They did their own version of it. The first thing they did is they just ignored the alternative media for the longest time possible. Then they began ridiculing the alternative media for the longest time possible. Now they call it fake news. What you see with the mainstream establishment media in the last 20 years is we can see a few developments with it. One is that it's become crazier than ever before. If you really just look objectively at how the news media itself portrays itself on TV, it's less dignified, much crazier, much more in your face, yelling and screaming, and more opinion rather than actual detached news reportage, all of that, and more integrated with popular culture, while it continues to ridicule UFOs. I think possibly we could see a definite transition to this around 1997. Here I'm talking about the 50th anniversary of Roswell. I should have included a mention of the Phoenix Lights, which also took place in 1997. And also the Heaven's Gate situation of that time. But I think Roswell maybe epitomized it. There was a huge media circus relating to Roswell that year, December of 1997. And during that time, the New York Times published a couple of articles that were major disinformation on behalf of the intelligence community. One was the Air Force's mogul balloon explanation. Another was they gave promotion of this article on the CIA's role in UFO phenomenon. It was total disinformation by the CIA. All of this coincides with the growth of the internet and increased interest in UFOs. So in the last 20 years, what we've seen is an explosion of websites related to this subject, relating to news on this subject. We have some alternative media that's open. We have some alternative media that is not open to it. Major media continues to take a very ham-fisted, ridicule, debunking approach. There's a true alternative media on UFOs. I mean, this is just a tiny smattering of it. One of those sources is openminds.tv, without a doubt, which has done really outstanding work consistently for the past several years to provide a very balanced, intelligent, rational view of the UFO phenomenon. And there are other sources as well that are worth looking into. Good journalists, Lee Spiegel, Billy Cox, a few others. RT does some interesting work on UFOs, even if it's not all fully checked. Some of it's pretty interesting, I think. And there are other sources as well. We still have the establishment media that doesn't go away. And the established, it's not just New York Times. I mean, we're talking Mother Jones and Daily Beast and many, many others. These headlines here particularly refer to, most of them refer to the citizen hearing on disclosure, which I was part of and a number of people here were part of. Strong language, ridicule language is always employed for these. I think none of them beats the Washington Post, though. If I were to take a guess today, like which institution is the preeminent, snarky, debunking news media on UFOs, it's got to be the Washington Post. I don't think anyone else competes. Time and again, the Post will always take the most heavy-handed approach to ridiculing UFOs, particularly in the last 15 or so years. This is one from 2007. At Roswell Festival, doubt is an alien concept. Gee, great, that's wonderful. And they have a little picture of an alien mask. Of course, this is how they want to portray the UFO phenomenon. They're branding the UFO phenomenon for you, but they're not branding in a way that you would probably appreciate. Their brand of UFOs is, this is really nonsensical circus time. Dana Milbank, who's done a lot of hit pieces on UFOs for the Washington Post, writes, there's the red vote, the blue vote, and the little green vote. Ha, ha, ha. So very funny. That was one of his portrayals of one of the X conferences that Steve Bassett organized. And then when we did the citizen hearing, the Post really went full high gear. The ridicule just was, they did a series of articles. The citizen hearing, say what you will about it, was a very sincere and, I will say to this day, 34 years later, a well-done attempt to engage this subject for retired members of Congress, to present the UFO phenomenon in an intelligent way, in a reasonable way, that is now on YouTube for all time. And there are many people who are introduced to the subject through some of those videos. And it showed the world that there were people who worked within the established corridors of power who were absolutely willing to look at this phenomenon. And I can tell you personally, having spoken to every one of those members of the panel, I saw a definite transformation in their beliefs on the subject of UFOs during that 1 week. Some of them were in a state of shock, frankly. Their worldview was truly transformed. As far as I could tell, that they were not making that up. They took it very seriously. And yet Washington Post writes, this is what a congressional hearing looks like in some kind of bizarro parallel universe. All your favorite past members are there, and the topic, extraterrestrials, as in little green men, and whether there's a conspiracy within the U.S. government to cover up their existence. The very language the Post uses, as you can see here, is tailor-made to give you the exact answer that this is all nonsense. In the immediate aftermath of the hearing, they did a couple of other hit pieces on the subject of UFOs. The fear that drives our alien belief. In other words, it's all like a religious need to believe and a disenchantment with the establishment news, which is a very unhealthy thing for you, by the way, according to the Washington Post. You're supposed to believe what they tell you. UFOs as a conspiracy religion. All of this nonsense, and it is absolute, utter, insulting nonsense. This one author writes, clap if you believe in fairies, squint upward if you believe in UFOs. The occupants of our subconscious manage to creep out. This is what Carl Sagan was saying in the 1960s. People once spotted goblins and fairy circles in the grass. Now it's aliens. Conspiracy is almost a form of religion. Thank you, Washington Post. Not doing us any favors, and you're not doing any genuine analysis. It's just an opinion piece posing as news in service of the national security state. The control over mainstream is more pronounced now than it was in the days of Mockingbird, in my opinion. It is influenced by more than the CIA. The Pentagon itself spends huge amounts of money on managing its social image, including not just bringing generals as consultants onto mainstream TV or embedding reporters in when they're invading another country so that they give friendly reportage, which they do all the time, but also by creating what they call socks or sock puppets, that is trolls, in the message boards under the news articles that you read. Many of these are creations of Pentagon employees, explicitly designed to manipulate your opinion on a particular subject. They do that. We know they do that. Thank you, Edward Snowden. That was one of the leaks that came out. The control, by the way, is not just national, it is international. This is Amber Lyon, a great lady. She worked with CNN back during the Arab Spring of 2011. She now, like a lot of good journalists, is a renegade, and she's talked explicitly. You can find her on YouTube and in articles. How CNN is routinely paid by the U.S. government and by foreign governments to selectively report on events and make up fake news stories. She's been talking about this for several years. And she talked about it explicitly relating to the Arab Spring as well. She's very, very forthright. This man, the recently deceased Dr. Udo Ulfkotte, who is German, a German journalist, died in January of this year, of 2017. There's an excellent YouTube video with him. You can read it, you can listen to it. He says, look, we all lie for the CIA. He talked about how the CIA wrote stories for him to use his name as the byline on subjects as Libya and Muammar Gaddafi. And he said, if I had refused, I would have lost my job. And he says this is the case with journalists all over Europe. The CIA dominates them. And you can read and hear him talk about this. Then there's this great lady, Cheryl Atkinson. This is a TED Talk that she gave on the phenomenon that is called astroturfing. Many of you have heard of this. She talks about it. She has a lot of interesting things to say. She worked with CBS. She was an investigative journalist. She talked about fake grassroots movements funded by political, corporate, or other special interests. In other words, organizations that will disguise themselves. They'll publish fake blogs that seem like they're independent. They'll create their own Facebook pages, their Twitter accounts. They'll create letters to the editor. You know, astroturfing on Amazon is, you create fake reviews of your book to make it look really good. People do that. Or work with Wikipedia. She talks about that. Wikipedia, she says, is an astroturfer's dream. Really, she said, there are cases where people will try to properly edit their Wikipedia entry, and it'll be up for 5 minutes, and boom, it reverts to some false information. There's clearly examples of when corporate interests, and she's really talking not about the intelligence community in this talk, but about corporations, pharmaceutical agencies in particular in this case, that have self-serving interests, then they will bribe Wikipedia editors. She talks about that. But they do all of this, and the idea is to confuse the truth beyond recognition, she says, and controversialize anyone who disagrees with their position. Corporations will create self-serving press releases. News agencies never check it. A number of years ago it was video news releases, VNRs. Now there's new versions of the same thing, but corporations will they have their own industry to create this news. They give it to news media, and news media just basically runs it without doing any checking for the most part. She has a very, very interesting part at the end of this talk, how to spot astroturfing. It's worthwhile for us in this topic of UFOs in the media. She says, anytime you start hearing inflammatory language, be on the lookout. Some of the examples she used in her talk were the words crank, quack, nutty, lies, paranoid, pseudo, conspiracy. She said, when you hear these, perk your ears up and be on your guard for what their agenda is. She says, this is not what ordinary people say. She said, this is what people who are working for agencies will say. In fact, it's worth pointing out here as an aside that the very phrase conspiracy theorist was a creation of, wait for it, the CIA back in 1967 when the CIA was in a classified memo discussing how to disable the then growing alternative narrative about the Kennedy assassination. And one way to do that was to use the phrase conspiracy theorist and to bring that into the public as a way to disable those individuals. Well, it's a phrase that has really taken off, and it's used by everyone. And, some of us, we kind of passively allow that to sort of filter through our society. We should be careful. And when you hear it, you hear someone use the phrase conspiracy theorist, you can remind yourself and maybe that person that was, in fact, a creation of the CIA. And they'll laugh at you, but then you can pull up the website and pull up the document and prove it to them. She says, be on the lookout for astroturfing when you hear claims that such and such a person has debunked a myth, especially if it's not a myth at all. Be careful when you start hearing them using personal attacks and character assassination, she says. And she pointed out something I thought was particularly interesting. She said, these people or groups, whoever who's supporting them, she says, you'll notice they're astroturfing when, instead of questioning authority, which is what good citizens are always supposed to do, they question those who question authority. They go after you to try to maintain a monolithic kind of religiosity in favor of the establishment narrative. And we can ask ourselves, does any of this sound familiar to those of us in the UFO field? Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. So one thing that I know I'm running tight on time here, I would suggest that the UFO subject, we're at a point now in the 21st century where we have to ask ourselves, is it becoming just another brand? In a sense. We have Republicans, we have Democrats. Well, they don't agree on things. We have UFO believers, we have UFO disbelievers. Well, they don't agree either. The thing is that the UFO subject is now in our culture, and it's not going away. And I sometimes wonder if we've gotten to a point where this phenomenon is just kind of an accepted part of our culture. I mean, after all, Hillary Clinton was on Jimmy Kimmel last year talking about it, and it didn't seem to hurt her at all. And in fact, other politicians now in 2016 talk about UFOs, or able to talk about UFOs without the media coming down on them necessarily. So I think we're in a different culture now. 2016 is not 1996, okay? And yes, I'm aware Hillary Clinton lost the election, but I don't think she lost it for the UFO matter, I'm just saying. The point is that the culture has changed. And so are UFOs sort of an accepted part of our culture as just a brand, just a money-making brand? I think part of the answer to that is yes. I think we kind of all understand we're not going to agree on UFOs. So that's the danger for us. Meanwhile, while UFOs have become a brand, a global brand, the propaganda war has not abated. You still have a campaign of delegitimization. UFOs, I would suggest, are treated by the mainstream establishment news media as part of the whole fake news meme that we're hearing all the time today, which is itself a very questionable tactic. And really the entire meme of fake news that we're hearing is, I believe, is a last gasp attempt by this establishment media to delegitimize the opposition, to delegitimize those of us in the alternative, non-straitjacket world, to break through that narrative, and they're losing the war. And I think they're just coming at us with more and more ridicule and invective, and now it's fake news. Next year it may be something else. They won't stop until we defeat them, until we truly show how threadbare and how transparent their service for the establishment and the national security community is. They will continue to ignore and ridicule UFOs as long as possible. They will continue to use tactics of astroturfing and propaganda. Are you surprised that the media lies to you? I don't think you should be. That guy lied about some certain things. The mainstream media is a control system. I'm just about wrapping up here. And it's a control system that is, I think, feeling itself under siege. And hence the intensity, the ratcheting up of its attacks on any source that disagrees. I firmly believe that I have to say, the obscene demonization of Russia that has occurred in the last year is an attempt by the mainstream media, again, to retain its control over all narratives relating to national security, as well as an attempt by the defense establishment to keep the party going in terms of spending $600+ billion a year on the destruction of the rest of the world and control over the hydrocarbons that exist. It's a last-ditch effort made by an establishment that realizes that the game is increasingly up. My fear is that in a society that is becoming increasingly polarized, I don't know if we're ever going to get to a point in the near future where we can actually have some kind of new consensus on a lot of things, including UFOs. Or will we continue to see a fracturing of our society and a continued increasing level of confusion? I don't think it has to be that way. If I were to conclude on any positive note, it would be in our personal lives, we would do very well not to do our best, to listen to the mainstream news, except if you want to go in as a counterintelligence agent and see what are they trying to make me believe. I really believe you're better off with that because you don't want this infiltrating your mind. If you are someone who turns on CNN or reads the Washington Post as your main source of news, I'm going to suggest to you that you're doing yourself a great disservice. You have to understand where that information is coming to. Ask yourself, why is CNN playing in every single airport gate in practically every single airport in the United States? Why? All right, it's not by coincidence that every airport manager says, oh, wow, I totally love CNN. I want to inform the public. Not true. All right, CNN is a private company. They're owned by Time Warner. Why do they get to play in every single airport? Airports, which, by the way, are all in heightened security status across the country ever since 9/11. So CNN, the reason that they get that sweetheart deal is very simple. They are the mouthpiece of the United States government. Always have been, but they pose as independent. That's what makes them acceptable. That's what makes them powerful as well. All right, that's what Operation Mockingbird was all about. It's what the CIA and the U.S. military call gray propaganda. Gray propaganda is a form of propaganda in which an allegedly independent source is making a statement that in fact serves the purpose of the government that is behind it. All right, it's a lot more effective, if you have, it's like a form of astroturfing. That's what great propaganda is, and that is what CNN does. So I would say, who's talking out? What are you asking me? Yeah, so I'm glad that you mentioned Fox because I always laugh. People hear me bitching about CNN, and then they go, well, what do you think about Fox? I'm like, as if Fox isn't part of the problem. Of course Fox is part of the problem. Why are you hijacking my talk? We can do this later. Stop. Enough. Okay? The problem with Fox is just as significant. They had us traipsing off into a war in Iraq in 2003. They are a very serious problem. All right? Stop with the bipartisan stuff. You have to step outside of Democrat and Republicanism. That is your biggest mistake. And the problem isn't simply, I say CNN because I see them as the ultimate symbol, all right, for the problem. The problem is Fox, and it goes all the way to NPR. So all the way through, all right? So don't think, thank you, simply because, I'm focusing on one means, if you hate Hillary Clinton, you must love Donald Trump. Oh, that's a mistake. Don't think that, because that wouldn't be true of me. The point is that what we have is a control system that incorporates the entire media, all right? So Fox is a problem, NPR is a problem, CNN is a problem, New York Times is a problem, Washington Post is a problem. If you remember that chart that Terry did that I redid for you, you had the CIA working with a variety of mainstream organizations. And our job as citizens is to be aware of this control system and to be aware that they deal with the UFO phenomenon just as they deal with anything else that they want outside their little reality box. They will continue to ridicule UFOs as long as they can. And again, our job is to recognize what they are and to continue doing our work in a responsible way. With that, I want to thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Excellent. I'll just grab this. Well, 11:36. Is that